Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. So thank you for joining us for the afternoon session of today's day-long retreat with Tan Nisabho. We're taking a look at engaged Ānāpānasati this Sunday. And welcome to some returning friends, Gita, Jens, Denise, Ron, Kumu, and all others. So for the afternoon session, Tan Nisabho will be sharing some words of Dhamma, and there'll also be time for Q&A. So if you have questions at any time, feel free to type them into the live chat, and we'll address them after the talk. So I'll pass things over to Tan Nisabho for the afternoon session.
Thanks, Vandana. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So today the theme is engaged Ānāpānasati, which means mindfulness of breathing. And welcome for all those coming back and any newcomers. It's good to see you. Good to have you here. I want to again express my gratitude for Empty Cloud receiving and hosting me, Bhante Sumino, Aya, Soma, and everyone here. It's been really wonderful. And also for this, the digital or internet community as well. And to review the Ānāpānasati Sutta, Mindfulness of Breathing, Majjhima Nikaya 118, is a profoundly important sutta in the Buddhist canon. The Buddha spoke of mindfulness of breathing as the abode of the Tathagata, which was the epithet he used for himself. And it was a technique which he recommended for his disciples frequently. And in contrast to the simplistic way it has been taught for so long in the West and elsewhere, the Buddha taught mindfulness of breathing as a robust and detailed system of exploring the subtle energies of the breath in the body and using them to nourish the body and by doing so, nourish the mind and heart, which will allow it eventually to calm, to gain a degree of unification, and then with such power and clarity to embark on insight and to discern clearly the truth of our situation and our experience. And the Mindfulness of Breathing Sutta is composed of 16 steps, which are divided into 4 sets of 4, or 4 tetrads. And these 4 tetrads roughly, actually exactly, align with the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So the first tetrad, mindfulness, aligns with mindfulness of the body. And the second tetrad with mindfulness of feelings. The third with mindfulness of mind. And the fourth with mindfulness of dhammas, or dhamma categories. And there's several other parallels which the sutta hyperlinks to, so to speak. It is overlaid by the 7 factors of awakening. So as one develops these 16 steps, they develop the 7 factors of awakening. That is mindfulness, investigation of dhammas, energy, rapture, bodily tranquility, concentration, equanimity. And additionally, the progression of the 4 jhanas, which the Buddha laid out, don't exactly align, and yet there are meaningful resonances between the tetrads and the descriptions of the jhanas. So it's a profoundly interesting landscape to explore. And this morning we spoke about the 4 initial steps of the Ānāpānasati Sutta. So that being one trains thus, or breathing in long, one knows I breathe in long. Breathing out long, one knows I breathe out long. That's the first. Breathing in short, one knows I breathe in short. Breathing out short, one knows I breathe out short. And we spoke about how when, by anchoring the awareness in evaluating the breath in this way, and adjusting the breath, using our tendency to control in a very conscious way, especially as our minds can be quite active at the beginning of meditation, to adjust the breath so that it feels comfortable, and to see which way of breathing settles the body and mind the most. So one can discern whether breathing in long and breathing out, say in a more subtle or short way, is the most comfortable. And intuitively, one can get a feel for this by asking oneself questions to direct the mind gently, such as what way of breathing feels comfortable, or how can I breathe in a comfortable way right now? And evaluating the breath in this way fulfills the second factor of awakening, investigation of dhammas. The third step is articulated by the Buddha as follows. One trains thus: I will breathe in, experiencing the whole body. I will breathe out, experiencing the whole body. And this is a really important step, as modern people tend to be profoundly isolated and alienated from their bodies, and therefore from the somatic sense and the intuitive awareness which resides in the body and in the torso and near the heart. We tend to be trapped in our heads. So this directive to become more and more sensitive to the body as a whole is both challenging and essential. And it also represents the point of departure from how mindfulness of breathing has been traditionally taught. The commentaries interpret this step to mean remaining aware of the whole body of the breath at the tip of the nose. And while maintaining awareness on one point can be useful if the mind is calm, it is extremely difficult when one's mind is active, especially initially in the meditation. And so increasingly, practitioners who I've met, and teachers and scholarship as well by Bhante Analayo and others, have pointed to the fact that the Buddha may well have been referencing what he said in the sutta, which is the whole body. So what this means is that after anchoring awareness with those initial 2 steps and evaluating the breath, adjusting it so it's comfortable, using that tendency to control consciously by really trying to feel what way of breathing is most comfortable. Because if we try just to, quote unquote, not control the breath, initially that can just mean that our tendency to control moves under the surface and works at a subterranean level, making the breath hot and tight. So then what one can do is, as I spoke of before, divide the body into 3 chambers and move from the first chamber around the head and neck, breathing there for a time and resting awareness in that upper chamber. And after one loses interest or the mind naturally drops to the second chamber around the torso and heart, one rests there for a time and can explore any blockages or points of tightness, at which point the awareness will drop to the third chamber down by the dantian, below the navel and including the tailbone, and then expanding awareness to encompass the whole body. And one can repeat this circuit as many times as feels comfortable until the mind settles down. And when the mind begins to settle, one brings it to one point while still maintaining awareness of the whole field of the body, like a spider resting at the center of a web, but sensitive to the whole web. And frequently this point can be the tip of the nose. And when the mind begins to settle in this way, then one can track the breath there like a small and subtle silk thread continuously, paying a special attention to the points between the exhalation and inhalation. And similarly, this leads to the 4th step of the Ānāpānasati Sutta, which is one trains thus, I will breathe in calming the bodily fabrication, and I will breathe out calming the bodily fabrication. And this bodily fabrication spoken of in the sutta can be thought of in several different ways. Explicitly, it's defined in the Sutta Pitaka as the in and out breath. So one can really feel the motion, the parts of the body that one squeezes or moves to squeeze the breath in and out, the lungs and the belly. And just pay attention to allowing those parts of the body to relax a little bit and work a bit less hard. And realize that as one becomes more sensitive to the flow of the breath energy as a whole, generally down what are referred to as the meridians, down the front of the body and up the spine, or reversing down the spine and up the front of the body, then the need to actually breathe with this motion of the body becomes less, and the breath becomes shallower in a subtle kind of way, or more subtle would be a better way of putting it. So this is how one calms the bodily fabrication. And similarly, as one becomes aware of this whole body and moves through these chambers, then one becomes aware of different knots in the body or points of numbness. So frequently, say, a knot in the throat or a knot of fear in the chest. And one can very consciously spread the breath energy to these places and calm them, either imagining it as light flowing through them or simply touching them with awareness and letting those knots relax. And as one does so, and as one rests in this full-bodied awareness, then the sensation of the breath energy flowing around the body will become more and more pronounced. And Bhante Analayo compares the first 2 steps to a condor flapping its wings, the breath, breathing, to gain elevation, and then the second 2 steps as the condor simply soaring with still wings, sort of on this more still breath energy. So this is and additionally, one always has the breath in mind and the background, in the periphery, even through all these steps, becoming aware of the whole body. And this effort to keep the breath in the background, it's the refrain of every step. One breathes in, one breathes out, is our effort, which is the 3rd factor of mind, awakening. So this is the first tetrad, the first 4 steps. And this is, in some ways, if one can come this far, then it's already a significant accomplishment to reacquaint oneself with the body and to sink into the lower realms of the body, such as the torso and heart and diaphragm, that have been so often lost to the modern person. And usually we can use visualization to do this, as I had spoken of, imagining the breath as white light coming in and out of each of these chambers and of the body as a whole. And this is comparable to the Buddha's image of the first jhana of a bathman kneading bath moisture into a ball of bath powder until it's pervaded. And one is nourishing all these parts of the body. The next step, the first in the second tetrad, which corresponds to mindfulness of feelings, is one trains thus: I will breathe in, experiencing piti. I will breathe out, experiencing piti. So this Pali term, piti, is frequently translated as rapture, but I find it to be not a terribly helpful translation. Piti is etymologically related to the word to drink, and I think the sense of refreshment is a much better gauge of piti, at least for me, in this way of practicing Ānāpānasati. So experiencing this refreshment, as one becomes sensitive to this flow of the breath energy, one feels refreshed, as if one is drinking this in. And it's a helpful translation too, in that all these images the Buddha uses to speak about these first levels of concentration, the bathman kneading water into the ball of dry bath powder, similar to how we knead water into dough or flour to make dough, have to do with moisture and water. And there is this sense, as the breath energy begins to circulate and one becomes sensitive to it, that it is nourishing the body and one is drinking and soaking it in. So the metaphor the Buddha gives for the second jhana is that of a still, clear mountain lake with no inflows or outflows to the north, east, south, or west, but with a spring of cool water welling up from below and occasional showers from above, so that no part of the lake was unpervaded with cool water. And what is significant about this analogy is that in the first analogy of the bathman kneading water into the bath powder, there's a very active element. Applied and sustained thought, vitakka vichara, we spoke of in the first talk. These applied perceptions of moving the mind around the body or using visualizations of, say, white mist coming in and out of each chamber to work with the breath. These are very active visualizations, and this is the element of applied and sustained thought. We're very actively working the breath energy through the body. Or similarly, just visualizing the breath energy coursing through the body. But as one becomes sensitive to the natural way the breath energy begins to course, and as these bodily knots and fabrications calm, and the breath energy flows more freely, then it becomes natural, just as this spring of water naturally wells up from the bottom of the lake. And there becomes much less need to actively apply perception. Instead, one simply feels the nourishing and refreshing nature of this energy pervading the body. And in each of these steps, it's important to reflect that it's usually you aren't on a single step in isolation. The Buddha speaks of progressing through meditation as similar to a mountain cow. Apparently they had mountain cows back in the day, climbing up a mountain and making sure 3 of its feet were well planted before the next step was taken. And I think that's significant because the cow has 3 feet planted at any one time. And I find that this is how I also work with this sutta is usually I'm straddling somewhere between 3 of these steps and moving back and forth, and then steadily you become stabilized and can move to the next. But the mind tends to go back and forth a little bit between them before progressing to the next. So for example, one might encompass the whole body with awareness and then become very sensitive to this breath energy flowing, and it might feel nourishing. But then perhaps the mind may coalesce back down to one single point at the tip of the nose for a time, and one may find oneself simply tracking the length of the breath once again. And for me, it tends to oscillate between this wide field of awareness and this single point until the two merge. And the next step in the sutta is one trains thus: I will breathe in experiencing sukha. One trains thus: I will breathe out experiencing sukha. And sukha is roughly translated as pleasure. And whereas piti is a sankhara, it moves, it's active and dynamic. It's the sense of the breath energy coursing through the body. Sukha is vedana. So it's still. It lacks the same dynamism. And similarly, when this flow of breath energy has coursed through the body enough, then most parts of the body have been nourished, and the mind will begin to settle, sort of like a sponge that has been thoroughly soaked in this cool water. And this, the Buddha has an image for the third jhana, which I think has a resonance with this point in some sense, although it doesn't overlay or correspond exactly, obviously. But he says that just as a pond of red, white, and blue lotuses, born in the water, growing in the water, and blooming in the water, would be completely pervaded by that cool water. Just so this, I believe, pleasure, he says, pervades the body or soaks the body. And I didn't get that exactly right, but the idea is that in this image, even that dynamic element of the water welling up from the bottom of the lake has disappeared, and the lotuses are resting in a still pool, a still field of water, and just resting in it. And the commentaries frequently compare piti and sukha, this rapture and pleasure, to seeing a man finding a pond after wandering in the desert and bending to drink. And the initial taste in that rush and refreshment is the piti, the rapture, the refreshment. Whereas the pleasure is after he's been drinking for a time and is satiated. So as one allows the breath energy to circulate in this way, then steadily a still field will emerge from that circuit. Similar to how when electricity moves through a circuit of wire, the emergent property of a magnetic field, which is still, emerges. And similarly, when the breath energy has been allowed to move, and as it does that, it will naturally relax the bodily fabrications, these knots in the body, and become and nourish the body. Then a sense of the still brightness will frequently come, a sense of being satiated, and one can simply rest in that, and the dynamic movement of the mind with that flow of energy will fade. And this is also frequently when a nimitta which is translated roughly as a sign, will manifest for people. Either the perception of light will fill the visual field, or if one has cultivated the sound of silence, which is a subtle hissing in the ears, which in some ways could be thought of as the auditory equivalent of the perception of light, then that will become very prominent at this point. In either case, a still object will begin to manifest. And for me, the mind at this point will begin to both rest in this broad awareness, but also frequently come down to a very single and increasingly refined point, for me at the tip of the nose and for many, although it could also be in the chest or elsewhere. And oscillate between these, and steadily these things will merge, similar to the spider resting at the center of the web that we spoke of. And also this nimitta can become more and more prominent, and one can give more and more attention to it and rest in this brightness and really cultivate it and rejoice in it. Although rejoicing might be a bit too coarse at this point, but really rest in that nourishment, just as the lotuses rest refreshed and still in that pond of cool water. And as one becomes sensitive to what it feels like for the body to feel nourished in this way, over days and months of practice, one will begin to realize how dry and starving parts of the body have been. So frequently once again, the back and the kidneys, the shoulder blades, it'll become apparent that those parts of the body have been dry for a long time. The outsides of the hips can actually be an extremely useful place to place attention. And this is the fourth and fifth enlightenment factor fulfilled, that of rapture and bodily tranquility. The sixth step, or the seventh, in the Ānāpānasati Sutta is, one trains thus: I will breathe in sensitive to mental fabrications. I will breathe out sensitive to mental fabrications. And the eighth is, I will breathe in calming mental fabrications. I will breathe out calming mental fabrications. And this word chitta sankhara is interesting. It is defined once in the suttas, only once, by a bhikkhuni named Venerable Dhammadina, who is noted for being foremost in expounding the Dhamma. And it's defined as perception and feeling. And my sense of this step is, or these two, is that when this bright field of awareness becomes more and more prominent, then one sees more and more clearly the play of perception and thoughts on the canvas of the mind, because the brightness of the canvas behind has become increasingly visible. That brightness of the mind that's being cultivated in pleasure and sukha is increasingly able to hold one. And so the small movements of thought and perception become visible on that. And as they become visible, one can let them go. And this stage can be disorienting for people. We orient ourselves by our chitta sankhara, by these perceptions. And so this can be where it's very helpful to really try to maintain continuous awareness of that, both the field of the breath energy and of that brightness, but also of the depending on where one's mind feels most centered, of the breath right at the nose or elsewhere at that single point one is selected, and maintain a very continuous awareness of that, because that will stabilize the mind during this. And as one does that, one can also begin to let go of all these. It's been a very active meditation till this point. Many visualizations, the conception of the body, and yet with the calming of mental fabrication of perception and feeling, many of those perceptions can just fade, can be let go of. And one can rest just in the sensation of the breath as a silk thread at the nose, or of this wide field of still and bright awareness. And let all the play of calligraphy on the canvas fade until one is left only with that bright field. And at this point, the field of awareness generally will have lifted higher in the body and be focused more from the heart up to above the head, and be associated with bright light for many meditators. And this is the second tetrad, mindfulness of feelings, which is plenty, I think, for this talk at the moment. And yet it's a helpful way of approaching this sutta, because one can tell if one's cultivating the first tetrad appropriately, mindfulness of the body, by if one is accessing these energies of refreshment and pleasure as well. So it's a good litmus test. And I think that should be enough for now, because I believe we have some questions that we are going to take. It's okay. Sadhu, 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 anumodami.
So much gratitude to Tan Nisabho for sharing those words of Dhamma with us. And again, if you have questions at any time, either from this morning's session or the talk that was just given, feel free to type them into the live chat and we'll address them as best as we can. And so far, we do have a couple questions. So hello to Chris, who asks, though, about the third tetrad. Does the third tetrad correspond with jhanas 3 to 4? What about the formless realms?
Oh, good question, Chris. The perfect overlay of the Ānāpānasati Sutta is it corresponds very well with the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and also to the 7 factors of awakening. And the Buddha lays that out explicitly in the intro. But the correspondence with the jhanas and these images around the jhanas isn't exact. So one working on first, these tetrads, even though we're working through them in a linear fashion, frequently they won't manifest linearly. Like, for example, the 4th tetrad will have aspects of relinquishing, of seeing impermanence. Sometimes if a thought is obsessing the mind at the beginning of a meditation, one needs to contemplate the impermanence, say, of that thought, or the burden of it. One needs to relinquish it. So, or say a mood is obsessing the mind at the beginning, in which case it might be really useful to look at that mood, that state of mind, which would correspond to the 3rd tetrad or parts of it. So, although it's helpful to look at this progression in a linear way, one can actually jump through to different parts of these tetrads at different times. And the jhanas, one cultivating any of these tetrads won't necessarily be in the same state of, say, even a state of jhana at all. So the I've found the images and language associated with the third jhana to be most useful for me, speaking about this state of sukha in the second tetrad. The third tetrad I found, which is mindfulness of mind, I found has really wonderful correspondences to the images the Buddha uses for the fourth jhana, of a body draped with a white cloth so that no part of the body was untouched by that white cloth. And I've spoken with Longpo Pasano, my teacher, one of them, and the abbot of Abhayagiri. And he spoke about how this image speaks to the feeling of separation from the body. The white cloth covers the body, but whereas the previous images have this connotation of something pervaded with this refreshing water, the white cloth draping the body implies the mind separating out a bit from the actual body, which I find has resonance with the experience of these states or these perceptions of light that can come, and with the increasingly refined sensitivity to the mind itself, which begins in the third tetrad. So these are rough resonances, and I just find the images very helpful, but they aren't exact correspondences. But yes, I have found that the images the Buddha gives for the fourth jhana are especially useful when applied to the third tetrad. So this is very complicated, I suppose, but it's fun. So. Mm-hmm.
And our friend Elaine says, Venerable Sir, can you kindly provide a reference regarding meridians? I don't really know anything about them, but I feel it would be helpful for my meditation practice.
Yeah, great question. So this isn't spoken of explicitly in the suttas. The Thai forest master Tanpor Lee went to India and saw the yogis there working with the breath energy and began to develop ways of doing it himself. And certain visualizations and such, one can read, I believe it's Keeping the Breath in Mind, a translation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu Ajahn Jeff of Tanpor Lee's teachings. And it provides some reference to the different ways the breath energy can move. But when the Buddha speaks about cultivating awareness of the whole body, this for me is, and for the teachers many of them I've spoken to, really can correspond to systems of visualizing and conceptualizing the breath that are found in almost across cultures, a huge variety of cultures. So the meridians I find are most beautifully articulated in Taoist thought. So Qigong is a very powerful practice and seems to be a bit of the secret weapon of many Ajahns in our tradition. I know Ajahn Pasano used to practice it until his hip got bad. Ajahn Jeff does a bit of it. Longpo Suchito will teach it at the beginning of every retreat. And many of the monks I know use it now because it's such a powerful technique. And it speaks of a few different things. There's the meridians, the main meridian of down the front, up the spine. But there's also other ones that circle around the body. And I find that going into these things too much is a bit of a rabbit hole. So I would recommend a book called The Way of Energy. That's a very helpful one. Similarly, Kundalini yoga speaks a great deal of, and yogic thought references these different ways the breath energy moves around the body. And in almost, there's a huge amount of correspondence and similarity. So I find that other systems have articulated these things better than the suttas themselves in terms of specifics. And that's usually what I reference. But I find Kundalini yoga and its visualizations of the chakras which correspond to what Tanpor Lee references the stations of consciousness, which correspond also to what the Taoists speak of in terms of, I believe, the microcosmic orbit or doorways into the breath body, which align along the meridians. They're pretty much the same across the board. So there's the crown of the head, there's a point in the center of the brain, there's a point near the throat, there's a point near the heart, there's a point down near the, it depends, I think some have one right above the navel, but mainly there's certainly one right below the navel and into the torso bit called the dantian. And then there's one at the perineum or near the tailbone. And those stations are places one can really place one's consciousness. It's a more refined version of the 3 chambers, but it can be very interesting to explore those and see what flavors of rapture, of pleasure are available at each, because it is different. I find it very interesting in that image of the still mountain lake the Buddha gives, that he references water welling up from below and showers from above, because in Taoist thought, the main sources of energy are the earth. And if one places one's awareness low in the body, one will feel fed by a very nourishing, robust energy, which I consider it could correspond to that water welling up from below. But if one places one's energy up in the top chamber, there's a bright, refined energy that comes in the Taoist conception from heaven or from the sky. And I don't know about, the language is problematic in any case, but it does speak to an experience. And this is the fun of this way of practicing, is it's interesting. And one can really play with these visualizations. And it's one of the reasons why this way of working with mindfulness of breathing is engaging and works for modern meditators with such active minds. And one can also become very skilled with the breath energy, bringing in different, using it in different ways to calm pain, to brighten the mind, to calm the body, to ground oneself. Just bringing the breath energy into the soles of the feet can ground one hugely during an argument, say. So it's a interesting landscape to explore.
And Jens says, Tan, can you speak to when we have sitting for an extended period and a bodily sensation of pain arises? Do you suggest to returning to calming the body or calming mental fabrications? Do we work with mindfulness of breathing and physical discomfort or mental discomfort?
I think that when pain comes up, it can be very helpful. This is one of the areas that working with the breath energy is most useful, maybe, because pain does come up in our lives, and chronic pain for many. And we will encounter pain a great deal. And what gaining an acquaintance with the landscape of the body allows is a much more nuanced and effective approach to pain in the body. So normally a pain will manifest in the body, and because every other place in the body is just some dull nowhere that's never been explored, then the pain shines out in isolation and one's mind gravitates towards it inexorably. And there's no ability to not focus and fixate on it. And it, because attention goes there, it becomes exacerbated. But as one works with this whole body awareness, one becomes sensitive to these other realms of the body and the parts of the map which were formerly there be dragons. You know, these dark parts of the map become places we've explored and found resting spots in, and which have a sense of well-being associated with them. So then when a pain comes up somewhere in the body, then one not only can move very consciously towards, one can counterbalance that by the fact that one has a sense of at least some well-being in the other parts of the body. And one can really cultivate that. For example, using this image of breathing, say, white mist through the shoulder blades, in and out. It doesn't sound like it would be very helpful, but there's a lot of pleasure there, actually, because usually these parts of the body have been dry. So one can work to, when pain arises, to find another place of the body and really cultivate a sense of refreshment there. And this provides one a refuge where one can stay when that pain becomes worse. And when one finds a place in the body that feels relatively okay, then one can begin to spread that well-being slowly to the painful part. So imagining the comfort in whatever part of the body feels okay, spreading and just touching lightly that place of pain, like you would a delicate or scared animal, and stroking it until it relaxes. And then that shell of tightness and clenched fear around the pain will slowly relax and allow us to be with just the pain in a form that's not compounded as we usually compound it. So Ajahn Sucitto says that with trauma, you shouldn't go in until you can stay out. And this allows us to find a way to stay out, at least at first. So it's helpful to cultivate these refuges in the body, in this whole landscape, and then to learn how to use that sense of well-being to actively touch places of pain. And that can be a really useful process in meditation, and it will come in handy sometime in life when there is great pain. And the same point of touching trauma, of touching pain, can be helpful in terms of working through bodily trauma. Most trauma is contained in the body in some way, shape, or form. So say a memory arises of a difficult thing in childhood, or even just something that echoes a great amount of pain, like being left, and you feel where that comes in the body, maybe a gut punch, something like that, then really bringing that recollection up in a safe spot of meditation and working through the bodily associated sensation, spreading that well-being to that place and relaxing that. You're addressing the sankhara, the formation, the pattern, the program at its heart, and you're decoding it at its very base. And that can relax it more than years of therapy sometimes. Not to say therapy is not important at times, but this is also helpful. And the final thing being that if the pain persists, which frequently it will, then yes, one can contemplate the mind's relationship to it. And Ajahn Jeff references the fact that if you go to the savannah trying to take pictures of all the animals, you don't ride around the savannah looking for every animal. You just wait right by the water hole, and then every animal comes there. And pain is like that. Every neurosis and difficulty and hindrance of the mind will circle around pain. So the excuses, the fear, the brief reprieve, which results in a sudden flash of joy and relief, every sankhara will circle around the pain. So it can be a very useful place to stay for a time and really see the motions of the mind in relationship to it. So yeah, working with the breath energy to find ways to not sink into pain, and then using pain as a way to look at these different elements of the mind. But then also, you don't have to challenge yourself every time. If pain comes up, not moving immediately, but not making every meditation an endurance test either. It's okay to move sometimes, just a little bit. But every now and again, one may really want to challenge oneself and be with pain in this way.
And we have a question from Nicholas who says, I'm wondering where to start with all this, mainly because I'm looking to stop suffering so much. Should I start with studying or meditation?
Good question, Nicholas. I would say doing both is good, but meditation is the essential element. So getting 20 minutes of sitting a day, at least in the mornings, will change your life very quickly. If one can start out into this path by getting a good 10-day retreat under one's belt, that provides a very stable foundation. It's hard to kickstart a meditation practice at home with no sort of immersion right from the get-go. So I know Empty Cloud offers residency programs. Look at their website. There's Goenka retreats, which are 10-day free Vipassana retreats. Tapping into all those is good, but I'd say getting 20 minutes a day locked in 6 days a week at least. And if one can move even more than that, then that's helpful. And then, yeah, bringing in study, explore different Dhamma talks and find teachers that resonate or a tradition that resonates and really use it and tap into these live streams regularly as well. There's a lot of Dhamma online now, so you have a lot of resources available.
And we have 2 more questions. One is from Denise, our friend, who says, my body vibrates and then the sound of silence becomes very prominent when my mind calms down. I still have thoughts that monitor the body and the breath and peripheral awareness of these 3 things. Should I try to narrow down attention to just one of these 3?
That's a good question. So for those who don't know, the sound of silence is a technique popularized recently, although I believe it's existed in the ether for quite a long time, is by Longpo Sumedho. And it's a subtle hissing that one can hear at all times. And if one becomes sensitive to it, then one can use it as one of their main meditation objects. Ajahn Sumedho talks about sitting through countless board meetings and just listening to the sound of silence as a way of not going crazy. So it's really a powerful object, and it counterbalances the breath well, because the breath can be very calming, but the sound of silence is invigorating. Ajahn Amaro was having a lot of trouble sticking with the breath for a long time because he got sleepy, but he took on a practice of sitting all the time and not lying down for his first years at Chithurst in England as a young monk. And his relationship to the sound of silence is what allowed him to cultivate that wakefulness. And if cultivated continuously, it can become extremely loud to the point where you can hear it over power tools. I hear it right now. So, Denise, for me also, yes. And there's a good book called The Sound, I believe it's called Inner Listening by Ajahn Amaro. If you type that in, Inner Listening, you can find it at Amaravati's website. It's a good sort of brief rundown of this. And yes, Denise, I also find that the sound of silence becomes very prominent, especially around the second tetrad, when this mindfulness of the body has sort of allowed the body to calm and become nourished, and this brightness of mind becomes more and more apparent. The sound of silence becomes very bright. And my sense is that Ajahn Chah compared meditation to what you want to do is the mind is like a chicken, and you place it in in Thailand, they have these inverted baskets that you place over the chicken, and the chicken runs around in the basket, but it doesn't leave the basket. So trying to control the mind, we're such effort-heavy creatures, and most of us somewhat neurotic, at least I speak for myself. So approaching meditation, our effort tends to be violent. And that's kind of like, the Buddha actually has a wonderful sutta where he speaks of catching a bird and squeezing it with all one's might, and it dies then and there. Just so my concentration fell away because of an excess of energy. or catching a bird and gripping it too lightly, and the bird flies away. And just so, because of a lack of energy, my concentration fell away. So if one is telling oneself to stick with a certain object, or really berating oneself, and this is how most of us approach meditation at the beginning, it's just strangling the bird. It's like trying to put the basket on the chicken, but just dropping a rock, So it's much more helpful to, first of all, direct one's minds with questions, as I spoke of. And then when even those verbal directions become too coarse, when the mind becomes refined, then to be very gentle with the direction and trust the mind to an extent. So for me, because your mind is staying within this realm of the body, the breath, some slight peripheral awareness, and the sound of silence, then that's good. That's a nice little realm for the chicken to run around in, and it's safe. Those are all valid objects. So letting the mind circulate between those little by little until it steadily comes to one more focused point, or rather, the whole field of awareness unifies. That being said, I do find that sometimes it can be very helpful when the mind gets this calm to really try, experiment with keeping the awareness continuous on one of these objects, just to see. So really at the tip of the nose, really tracking that continuously and trying to really stick with it. But the mind will become tired of that, perhaps, and oscillate back to the sound of silence, in which case that's fine. If it feels hungry for that, let it do it. As long as the mind is remaining within the realm of those objects you mentioned, that's a safe realm for the chicken. So yeah, you can let it have a bit of its basket in it and trust that it will calm of its own accord.
And the final question comes from Chris, who says, when the sound of silence or light arises, should one make that the primary object and have the breath energy or the body be secondary, or the other way around?
I think once again, the breath, the actual in and out of the breath is always there in the background. In every one of these steps, that's the refrain. He trains thus, breathing in, I will experience the whole body. Breathing out, I'll experience the whole body. So that's always in the periphery, and it grounds us. In terms of which of the objects to bring to the forefront, I think it's speaks to what I just talked about, in that one can kind of trust the mind in this. Like, odds are it will be a bit like the mountain cow, in that when one of these bright objects arises, the mind will go to it, and that's because it's a very still, stable, subtle object. The perception of light or the sound of silence. And to let it do that and to rest in that for a time, remaining peripherally aware of the other things in the background, and making an effort to not completely lose the plot with those basic foundations of this whole progression, the breath. But then when the mind naturally oscillates back to, say, the breath energy as a whole and really focuses a bit more on that, then yes, allowing it to do that. And my experience is that at a certain point, that oscillation just results in a unification of these objects. Yeah, so it's something worth playing with, really, and seeing how it manifests for you, I suppose.
Thank you. And that was the final question of the afternoon. So thank you, Tan Nisabho, for sharing your thoughts, and also thanks to everyone for joining in, watching, participating, and asking questions. So this part of the afternoon live stream will end, but from now until 6 p.m., you're invited to do some personal practice, perhaps practicing mindfulness of breathing, walking meditation, or what feels right for your practice. And then at 6 p.m., you can return for some chanting, as well as a Dhamma Talk from Tan Nisabho to close the day.
And just to review these are just my ways of working with this sutta, and they're ones that have been echoed by different teachers in my life, but some of these are my own interpretations. And hold it lightly. The point that I'm getting at more is that it's worth playing with and exploring, and it can be that, and it should be that, because that interest in this process will lead to greater mindfulness. Remaining mindful of something you're just bored with is really hard over a few years, and it's not enjoyable. So yeah, make it fun, play with it, and become skilled. And it's a huge source of nourishment for the body and heart. But hold everything I say lightly, and just take it more as an invitation to play. And these are different ways of playing with it. So just to add that caveat.
Much gratitude. So we can end this session with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
And enjoy the rest of the afternoon.